you have all these people saying, but it's not feminist enough to take sexy selfies and put them on Instagram. So tell me, middle-class feminism, what is the sweet spot you'd like us to hit that would be an acceptable way to present our sexuality to the world? That idea that women who are beautifying themselves or presenting in particular ways are in competition with each other.
What makes a good selfie?
My name is Abby.
And my name is Liam, and you're listening to the Evolving Love podcast.
In this podcast, we deep dive into the topics of non-monogamy and relationships, drawing from our experiences of being consensually non-monogamous for over a decade.
Whether you're monogamous, polyamorous, curious, or anything in between, we invite you to join us for this conversation.
Let's begin.
Well, what a treat we have in store for this episode of the Evolving Love podcast. Today we sit down with photographer and academic Dr. Emma Phillips to explore the cultural, feminist and personal dimensions of an activity that we hold close to our heart, the sexy selfie.
Emma is a photographer and researcher lecturer in visual communication at the University of Canberra. With 12 years of professional photography experience in Australian media, design and advertising, and 8 years teaching photography and visual communications across Melbourne, Sydney and Canberra, Emma brings a wealth of expertise to her work. In 2022, she completed her PhD at the University of Technology, Sydney, on the intersection of sexy selfies with class, and has been a finalist in the prestigious Australian National Photographic Portrait Prize.
In today's discussion, we talk about the cultural hierarchy between selfies and self-portraits, why we are motivated to take sexy selfies, the role of the male gaze, the role of validation, aesthetic bias and class judgments, sexy selfies as erotic communication, photographer-model power dynamics, masculinity and the male selfie, creating environments for artistic exploration, how selfies can help foster community, and so much more. And now we bring you Dr. Emma Phillips. We are very excited to have this conversation because Abby and I are both very much fans of the selfie. So you have written an incredible PhD that really captured my attention. As soon as I saw the title of the PhD, I was like, we have to talk to Emma on the podcast. And the title of your PhD was The Aesthetics of Sexualization, a study of gendered and class discourses through the co-creation of representations of sexy selfie takers. I would love to know how you came to be doing a PhD with this topic.
I'm a photographer. I've been a photographer for probably 12 or 14 years now, mostly working in Melbourne as a professional portrait photographer, so commercial kind of stuff. And I was also working at RMIT, just doing sessional teaching there in the photography program. And I had a couple of colleagues nudge me and say, you know, you should do your PhD. And I was like, that is the most ridiculous thing you've ever said to me. No. And of course, years down the track after a bad relationship, decided it was somehow a good idea. And I had to do a year of honours to get into PhD just to prove I could, you know, actually study again years after having studied as a kid, really. And I moved to Sydney to be with my partner and, did my honours in Melbourne at RMIT in the School of Art. And at that point, I was really stuck in this idea that the kind of Kim Kardashians of the world were bad for feminism. And I feel really embarrassed to admit that now because I've gone completely in the other direction. But it was a year of that and having people in my art school really support that. And they did it in a really interesting way, which was to deride the younger feminists in the room who were pushing back against what I was saying. And they were like, oh, look, they don't really know a lot just yet, you know, that kind of idea. Anyway, long story short, I moved to Sydney to be with my partner, went to UTS to do my PhD, met a man who just flipped me the other direction. And I started to really open up to this idea that, you know, sexuality comes in all kinds of forms. And I was really in this vein of thinking like many, you know, middle-class educated feminists that was, Kim Kardashian sailing feminism down the river and the Pamela Andersons of the world. This kind of, you know, overt sexuality was not okay. And yeah, just looking at ways that the idea that sexuality comes in many forms and for feminism we need to open up to, you know, it being not necessarily just the one thing that feminism says it should be.
And so through that process of having this broader understanding of like the the limitations that were being put on, the understanding of like what is considered art and where should the self, the relation between art and the selfie. At what point did you really dive into the selfie aspect sort of for yourself and with other people? Was that something that came about because you were also exploring selfies within your own self, or was it just more what you were witnessing in the world around you?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's probably both of those things, I think. There was a little project I did while I was at art school in Melbourne where I was starting to take photos of myself, some semi-nude ones, and then sort of running it through a digital processor and then running it through again and again and again just to see how far I could push it, and just became like a blue screen in the end. It was actually kind of a boring art project when I think about it. But there was that going on, and there was just a broader look at the way that selfies had begun to inform our visual world. And of course, I'm a portrait artist, so it was like, well, this is just a new form of portraiture. For forever we've had the self-portrait, and I think this is a nice distinction, the difference or the supposed difference between the self-portrait and the selfie, right? And the self-portrait, by its language, occupies this kind of higher cultural space in photography particularly and in painting. And then selfies were like this lower kind of, cheaper so-called cultural object, right? And I was like, what is that? Why is that going on? Why do we code them that way? And what is it about the aesthetics of a selfie that is, a short distance from your camera wide angle lens, maybe it's a bathroom selfie, whatever, compared with a self-portrait, and why do we see that as a so-called cheaper thing? So that just really took my attention. And then, of course, it became apparent that women were being particularly targeted for the shade that was being thrown on selfies as being vain and narcissistic. And then if you throw the sexy selfie into that, it was a whole other level of criticism. So I'm like, all right, this is going to be fun to open this out and, take a stance against women I was kind of sharing spaces with in academic circles who might have thought they were too disgusting. So it just grabbed me. I suppose the other thing, if I'm not drawing this out too far, is just the photographic aspect. So I think, photography's life since it was invented in the mid 1850s or something, has gone through only a small series of really large technological changes. Like it was kind of born whole in a way, but those changes have been significant. So for example, the little Hanamex thing we had in the 1950s and 60s where even housewives could start to take photos, And this shift to everyone having a camera in their back pocket is like a monumental shift in the technology of photography. So that aspect as well grabbed me as a photographer. So lots of nice intersections for me.
Well, of course, with the selfie, there is that question of like, what is the intent of the person taking the selfie when they're posting it? And if they are putting it, say you mentioned Kim Kardashian, of course, a lot of the critique that gets leveled against her was that she was almost commodifying her looks as a way to use the selfie to almost over-sexualize herself and then use that to then sell on. And do you think that some of the critiques that were leveled against her were because people felt deeply uncomfortable about that for whatever reason?
Yeah, absolutely. There's probably some very reasonable critique about this late stage capitalism and the way that people are commodifying, or everything is kind of commodified and we sort of can't escape it. So I accept that argument to some degree. But I'm never sure or never understand why someone like Kim Kardashian or anyone who has so-called sexualized themselves, and I just want to always say that I'm not sure we can sexualize ourselves. I think that is something someone else does to us. So there should be seen to be a freedom in our choice to, show ourselves however we want to be seen. But yeah, I do accept that there was a criticism around the making money aspect, but what's the difference between doing that and making money from making a podcast or taking photos for a magazine or whatever we do,
With your work, when you were talking with women or different people who were taking the selfie, what were sort of the big intentions that were coming up for people as to why they were doing it?
I love this question because I think the answer is actually like more simple and slightly more boring than people expect it to be. And of course, there are a myriad number of answers, but I think overwhelmingly, the women that I worked with, they're doing it for fun. It's like I'm taking photos and my own photos for commercial purposes, putting them on my Instagram feed in the hope that people are going to like them. I mean, literally want likes like we all do, right? I want to have some exposure and some conversation in the world about whatever my deal is. And it's the same thing. It's actually a thrill to have people engage with what you do. So there's that aspect of it. But to go a bit deeper with it, there were some really fascinating responses to the questions that I asked them that I didn't see coming. So, for example, one of the participants or women I worked with had gone through a really heavy-duty anorexia in her teenage years, like hospitalized level kind of anorexia over a good 2 or 3 years. And once she'd emerged from high school, she started to feel healthier, was healthier in her body, and was taking selfies as a way, sexy selfies, as a way to affirm her own, bodily health or her own growth. And that was just, I sat there with her sort of with half a tear in my eye and thinking, I can't argue with your standpoint here about what these selfies mean to you, and how badly our culture is missing these kinds of stories when it says, well, you're just a dupe for patriarchy and selling feminism down the river,
Do you feel like when you were in those conversations with her, you were still at a point where you were holding on to some of those views? Like, was she part of the unraveling of that for you?
Absolutely. Yeah. No, I'm glad you asked me that. And yes is the short answer. And even, it took quite a while through my project before I could let go of some of those older views and to really understand where they'd come from, how I'd been colonized in my thinking, I suppose, that was kind of, an internalized misogyny and anti-feminist sorts of stances, which I'm going to say again, I'm quite embarrassed to even admit now, And there was another woman I'd love to mention, Blair, and she'll be perfectly happy for me to say her name. There's full consent given from all the women I worked with. She had several surgeries on her body to, make her butt bigger and boobs, and she'd had teeth done and just was sort of lovely, beautiful, big, sexy body. And she arrived at the photo studio and pretty quickly just took all her clothes off and had a dressing gown sometimes, and this incredible confidence and not showy, just good in herself, And she said to me, I had this really big personality and I needed my body to match it. I'm like, yep, I can't argue with you again. And it was just another one of those moments of turning around from somehow, lumping all these women who were doing sexy selfies together in some sort of boat as if they all existed under the same patriarchal view, really, is what I had. So all these beautiful individual stories and what it meant to them. And it was significant, real life affirming stuff.
It's a sense of almost like reclamation of your own sexuality.
Definitely.
Or like of your own body or your own identity. Like that beautiful story about, the woman who was taking the photos to kind of reclaim herself after that battle with anorexia. Like, it's such a powerful thing that selfies can have and art can have as the catalyst for kind of really propelling yourself forward. But I am interested because one thing that we often get leveled against us, we're sharing publicly about our relationship, where, Abby's sharing, beautiful photos of herself, that, online is people go, it's great to take selfies. Like, that's great that you're taking these photos of yourself, but why do you have to put them online? Like, is it just purely a sense that you need that validation? Like, you could have potentially just hoarding all these beautiful photos, you could hoard all this beautiful art of yourself, but why are we kind of driven to kind of then put them on Instagram or put them on Tumblr back in the day, or, wherever these photos might end up?
Look, I don't have an easy answer to that, but I think where my head goes is that we are social creatures where we do seek validation from each other, sometimes not in especially healthy ways. I can certainly attest to that in my own life. But we do act socially, and I'm not sure, there was one woman I worked with, Michelle, who talked about not doing it for anybody else. So she did have a public profile.
Right.
And at the time that I met her, all of her images on Instagram were from the neck down. So she didn't want her face to be seen. She was working in quite a high finance position in Sydney and just didn't, want her face to be shown because she was afraid of all the things you can imagine. And she talked about doing it for herself. So she would go out and buy this lingerie and she was really insistent with me that it was for herself. And I remember just pushing back gently and saying, but you're putting it up publicly. So, it has to be about others as well. And that invited the conversation about the male gaze, which I know that, we talked about briefly over email, I think, and that there was some, not just kind of an okayness, but an invitation to that gaze because these were some women who were interested in having sex with men and wanted to, there's a sexual drive and invitation that seemed pretty natural to me.
Well, there's so many things we could go there with what you just shared. There's like the process, she's going out and she's buying the underwear and she's thinking about how she's going to craft this. It's like, to me, that's a beautiful expression of like having intentional time and like putting time aside to sort of see yourself in that way. But then it is actually, in my opinion, it is also okay for her to share that and to, to connect in with people and to connect in with the male gaze if that's what she wants. And there feels to be a sense of empowerment with that because that's not, she's in charge of what photo she's putting out. That's on her platform. She's sharing that. She has the ability to also take that down. She also has the ability to change her mind. And if she's feeling that, I think that in my understanding of it, there's just nothing wrong with that. But it does bring a lot of, I think there can be a lot of demonization around who is this for. And sometimes, it is okay to have that validation from somebody else.
Yeah.
We're not all narcissists for wanting that.
Yeah, that's right. And I think you raised something really important around the idea that we struggle, I think, in our culture to see that women are even capable of having that level of agency, that must be something they want in and of themselves and for themselves, that it simply must be informed by something that men do or want or have said, or patriarchal values or whatever. And of course that's there. We can't escape it. But I think that sort of instant view, and I encountered this so many times over, including with my own ethics committee at the uni, who took 5 months to give me the okay for this project.
Wow.
Yeah, there's a whole story in itself.
My goodness.
But their view largely was that the women I was planning to work with were kind of victims already. From the outset, they were victims of something I'm not even sure they could totally pinpoint, but it was if they were showing their bodies in that way publicly, there must be something wrong with them.
Like a trauma in the
background.
Trauma,
that's right.
Yes.
Like a sexual trauma, or, overly influenced by patriarchal male gaze type norms, which meant that they weren't really able to decide for themselves what was best, right? And so if I'm coming in here as a feminist academic, as a professional photographer, I might therefore exploit them further or cause them more trauma. And it was a really interesting 5 months of putting together arguments with my supervisor's great help, which said, well, they're not necessarily, and here's why, and here's the evidence we have for a kind of standpoint feminism, kind of like what you're talking about, Abby, which is that they do know what they're doing and they've got a very clear understanding of where it sits. And, and I think that was and is very challenging for a lot of people who wish to think of these women as victim.
And there can be a multiplicity of different intentions behind, posting these selfies. Like, I'm sure, and Abby, maybe you could speak to this, but, when you're posting like a beautiful photo of yourself, there is a sense of you're proud of the art in and of itself. Like, that's a beautiful thing that you can really stand behind of, whether it's a compositional thing that you really love or the way that you're portrayed in it. But then there also is that factor as well of the male gaze that you might be inviting in a photo if you're posting it. But it's tricky to kind of really, if we're just going to kind of monolithically say it's only one thing, it's like if Kim Kardashian posts like a mirror selfie, she's only doing it to be sexualized. It's like, well, there actually could be quite a few things going on in the background.
For me, when I think about the photos that I share on Evolving Love, they're photos that we take together, but I'm very much a part of the direction of that. It's a collaborative experience also because you are a photographer and it's a process that we have together, but I'm very much a part of we're deciding together how the photo will be. And it's a beautiful moment. It's beautiful to be together. It's to be, having that special time, but also to capture the different moments of the stages that I am. We've had pregnancy shoots, we've had postpartum shoots, we've had, the whole range of different types of photos that we've taken. And for me, I find actually as a writer, the photos that we've taken have been such an inspiration for different pieces that I write about. Sometimes when I'm thinking, what am I going to write about this week on my Substack, I'll look through the photos that we've taken and I'll come across one and I remember what I was feeling in that moment, or the expression on my face reminds me of something, or something that you shared. And it's sort of this, it's actually part of the creative process. And even sharing about the writing actually came initially from wanting to share about these photos, because I had all of these photos that we have taken and I had nowhere to put them. And it was sort of very small, thinking I'm going to actually start sharing these photos that we have, or else they're just going to die on a hard drive somewhere. Yeah. There might be some judgment along the way, but could share them with the world. And then the stories actually came after the fact of wanting to share from the photography, which I find really interesting.
Well, what distinguishes the photos that you share as well is that a lot of the times, and Emma, I'm sure you can speak to this, is that because I am a photographer, I'm taking them with very specific photographic kind of intent in mind. You know, I'm thinking about composition, I'm thinking about framing, I'm thinking about, you know, how to kind of capture you in a way that, you know, really allows a photo to kind of speak volumes. But then, of course, as part of your PhD, Emma, you were kind of approaching people and working with them, of course, yourself being a photographer, and they were used to taking selfies just by themselves, and maybe they weren't necessarily trained in photography. You would have had to really consider, you know, what makes a good photo as part of how you were engaging with this.
Yep.
Because, like, what makes a good selfie?
You've just kind of hit the absolute crux of the PhD, I think, Liam, actually. And the idea of what makes a good photo is, I mean, it's subjective, we know that, but also there are a kind of, I guess, like a set of dominant aesthetics that are cultural, you know, that are, which mean that certain images are valued more than others. So it comes down to this idea of cultural value, right? So I always like to kind of casually say when people, if I've got to summarize my PhD in, you know, in a minute, if Kate Blanchett took a sexy selfie, we'd all be like, oh, look at it, it's amazing.
Yes,
Somebody put it in a gallery, right? And everyday Sally Jones, who's doing her sexy selfie thing, is a slut.
Yeah.
Why is that? What's the difference? And the difference generally, there are a number of layers, but I think generally comes down to these kind of aesthetics, this sort of professionalized aesthetics where Kate Blanchett's probably using a professional photographer and professional lighting or a studio setting or whatever. So the image will have a look to it that is accepted in those professional spaces. A magazine cover look to it, you know, maybe an advertising look, that cinema look, something like that. Whereas the everyday bathroom selfie doesn't have that same attention to so-called quality lighting and, you know, whatever.
You should see Abby's bathroom selfies are on point.
I bet they are.
Abby nails it.
Yeah, that's right. You got that lighting right. That fluoro lighting right in the front of the mirror. It's the bomb.
Exactly.
Yeah. And it's you know, something I had to really contend with during the PhD and working in collaboration with these women who don't have that same training that I've got. And there's no value judgment there. It's just an objective, you know, I've had training they haven't.
Yeah.
It was to really confront the idea that I have this kind of institutionalized way of thinking and my own images sit well. I've kind of got, in a sense, access to or the keys to, you know, the higher end media spaces in this country. I've had, you know, reasonable sized gallery shows and so on. I've had an agent, you know, and I get access, right, because I have this like legitimizing lens, if that makes sense. I've got the professional lens. And what I always struggled to come to terms with is how we can't really separate that from, you know, or there's a value judgment implicit in that. So whatever so-called Sally Jones is doing somehow has all these moral layers attached to it when it's really just an aesthetic difference. So what makes a good photo? I find it a lot more challenging now to answer that question, whereas once upon a time would have been like, oh, well, good lighting, you know, nice attention to the stylist having sort of the hour, bit of makeup, you know, moody something, whatever.
Because it's also the place in which the photo is seen. Like if you took a sexy selfie,
context.
like Abby, if you took one of your beautiful bathroom selfies and then we put it up at the National Gallery and invited, you know, 100 people to come and look at it, that would be very different to you posting on Instagram. You know, so it's also the audience and the place in which it's framed. I think really can you know, affect that as well.
Context is everything, right?
Yeah. Do you find that, you know, when you're looking at different photos of the nude female form, can you often tell if it's been a male photographer versus a female photographer?
That's a great question. I can't, to be honest. I haven't actually observed that.
Yeah.
But I'm just going to launch off that anyway and have a little rant about something if you'll allow me.
Oh, please.
You know, obviously I'm a photo nerd and I think about the histories of photography as well and kind of art nerd as well. And of course, there's been this long history of the male gaze in terms of art of the female nude, right? So whether that's like rock art painting right through to photography and so on, of course, painting so many female nudes in galleries around the world that were done by men. And now we have a situation where the technology allows pretty well all of us to take selfies, sexy selfies, whatever. So women have picked up the camera en masse and gone, I'm going to do photos of myself the way I see fit in my bathroom or in the whatever, you know, on a sand dune somewhere, doesn't matter. And that suddenly becomes the site at which women are so heavily judged. Not that men have been exploiting, and I mean, there have been criticisms, of course, but they've been in this rarefied space of being in a gallery or something. And women go, I'm going to do it this way, but that's not okay. There's my rant.
I love that.
Or the start of my rant that might grow.
When I hear about like the judgment and the gatekeeping and that this isn't feminist and that's wrong and that's the male gaze or she's exploiting herself, shouldn't be doing that. To me, it feels like some sort of internalized misogyny to be diminishing another woman for her self-expression in that way. To me, it's like that's where the negativity lies and not so much the photo.
Look, it's a difficult conversation to have, I think, because it's actually largely women, and I'm catching myself because I'm about to talk about older women and middle-class women, and there's all kinds of judgment laden in that, right? So I'm sort of careful as I say this, but overwhelmingly I encountered women who were from a middle or upper class background, may or may not be from an art world, but who had daughters particularly, 16, 17-year-old daughters who had started picking up the camera and doing sexy selfies on the beach and putting them up. And they're all doing it and it's kind of just their cultural norm, right? Mm-hmm. And the mums are having a fit that they're now going to be exposed to sexual predators, that they're cheapening feminism and so on, without really that conversation I think you're bringing, or that the critique that you're bringing up, Abby, that is actually an anti-feminist place to be, to judge another woman for her choices, And of course, one of the central tenets of feminism is choice, right? But we're not allowing other women to choose what they want to choose. And this idea too, I think that if they're showing their bodies in a particular way, or there's plenty of skin that they're showing, that is somehow playing into the hands of patriarchy because that's the male gaze. What is it then that they want us to do? What is it? Is it to cover up? And how much should we cover up? And then, of course, you quickly get into territory that's like, oh, well, there are women who do cover up in the world for religious or cultural reasons or by their own choice, who then get criticised as well. So tell me, middle-class feminism, what is the sweet spot you'd like us to hit that would be an acceptable way to present our sexuality to the world?
With the big things being at both ends of the spectrum, it's still something that's being navigated for and around the male gaze.
Yeah.
So when you were doing these photo shoots with, I think you used the term co-collaborating. Is that right?
I think co-creation or collaboration.
Sorry,
yes.
Yeah. So when you were co-creating, with these models, were there discussions where you talked about like how to make the photo sexy? If it's not going to be for the male gaze, if it's for you and, your subject that you're taking the photo of, to have that discussion and to really arrive at a place together where you feel safe and you feel like you're creating, this sense of like artistic output. How do you navigate what is a sexy photo? Because like you're saying, it's like, how much skin do I show? Do I show a nipple? Does that mean it's suddenly way more sexual than, a photo without a nipple? Like if there isn't a nipple, can it still be a sexy photo? Like there's all these questions that kind of float around in one's head when you think of, the stereotypical sexy selfie.
I love this question. And even the word sexy was hard to use in an academic context because it, like in and of itself, sounds kind of low end, right? Like sexuality is fine, sex is fine, but sexy was kind of something else altogether. But yeah, this idea of what constitutes sexy was really, I had to really shift my own views on it and realize that there are so many kind of class judgments about what makes sexy as well. So for example, one of the things I did once we'd taken the photos, once we'd done the co-collaborations, was to reflect on my own the ways that I wanted to shape the images. So we had lots of conversations beforehand. I really invited their input. They gave me a bunch of words that were sort of how they saw themselves and then what their aspirational self was, what would a beauty mean to them, what does sexy mean to them, and try and craft this shoot that was as much a collaborative effort as possible. What I found, of course, was that they deferred to me much more than I was hoping for. And I think that's going to be the case. There's a massive power imbalance. I'm a professional photographer. I'm a fucking academic, right? And they're coming to this research project as research subjects. Like there's going to be big power imbalances. And no matter how much you try to destabilize that, it's going to be there, right? So it'd be silly to acknowledge otherwise or think otherwise. So I noticed myself, they would want to do, I suppose, lots of clothes off stuff, lots of bright kind of light stuff. And I wanted to pull it into darker territory, like little spotlights that would highlight certain parts of the body or edge lights that revealed a shape rather than the whole body. And I suddenly realized that I was really in that kind of aesthetic vein of like suggestive and erotic.
Yeah.
Rather than overt here are my tits, right? And there's a class, there's a class element to that, because middle classes will prefer things to be kind of hidden and quiet and suggestive. That's the kind of sexuality that's okay. Those are the kinds of movies.
Palatable.
It's palatable.
Yeah.
It's safe. It's safer. It's safer. And it probably sits in a canon of so-called sexualized imagery that is, I don't know, moody and dark and a bit more intellectual or some shit like that.
A bit more high art.
Yeah, a bit more high art. Exactly. And so anything that's much more light and bright and overt and immediately obvious was like, oh, well, that's just, low-end slutty stuff again. So it was a challenge for me to recognize that was in my thinking as well. And there was this, it was never a tension between us, but there was a comparison done in the methods part of stuff between their own images, what was on Instagram, and then my so-called professionalized images to really pick apart what these aesthetics mean in our culture. And it's significant.
Yeah.
Not my stuff, but that idea of it is significant.
If you are enjoying this episode of the Evolving Love podcast, we invite you to follow, comment, and subscribe. Sharing the podcast with friends, family, or lovers is the best way to support the Evolving Love podcast.
If you are interested in diving deeper and accessing my premium writing archive and other exclusive content, you can sign up at evolvingloveproject.substack.com.
Did you find yourself gravitating towards wanting to experiment with other styles of taking photos, like moving away from that really moody, suggestive kind of lighting to kind of seeing if you could still have the essence of the sexy selfie, but in a brighter, kind of more similar to what they were posting on Instagram?
Yeah, I did afterwards, Liam.
Right.
I've missed the boat. So I'll have to do the post PhD study where I'm really getting outside of my comfort zone. Because now, in fact, this is probably the first time I've thought this really, now that you said it. I think the women I worked with were well outside their comfort zone working with me, a stranger and all the sort of power imbalances, and really what a gift to me. But I worked within more or less my comfort zone. So damn it, I should get out of mine,
I mean, there are some artistic shackles that come from being a trained photographer. I think about this in terms of my music and the way that because I went to music school, and that kind of gives you this sense of framework of this is how you should do it. This is the proper way. If you don't do it this way, then you can't be a musician. And I think, I do wonder whether that would also maybe play into it for you as well. You're thinking that there's a structure to all of this.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think constantly about that idea of audience and gaze, and we've talked about the male gaze, but I've got, a gaze, I wonder whether there's a word for it, but the kind of gaze that's been around for me with regards to my commercial work are my clients, prospective clients, my friends, my circle of people, right? And we're all from particular cultural groups, whatever they might be. And some have more power than others, right? So kind of my, white middle class academic professional photographer groups has a certain amount of power. And I want to make sure that whatever I do keeps attending to that group so that I don't get social ostracization from my group, right?
They think Emma's started posting all these crazy selfies.
Yeah. Emma's gone bathroom selfie. What's going on? We can't be friends with her anymore. And there is that fear. I mean, as ridiculous as it sounds, I think somewhere in the back of our minds we think about, or I think about, I can't speak for others, but I think about, making sure I do things which keep me safe, I suppose.
Yes, yeah. Well, that's the other thing as well. And something that, Abby, you think about with the Evolving Love platform is that I don't know how comfortable you would feel sharing like a selfie that deviated a lot from the kind of photos that I take of you.
I have shared some selfies, I think probably not for a while now, but I think probably more in Instagram stories. But I definitely feel like the Instagram or what accompanies my writing on Substack is usually, 99% of the time it's, one of your photos or our photos that we've sort of created together. In a way, my selfies are more private. So I love taking selfies and I love sharing selfies, but it's, on our Instagram isn't really the place for them. But it's not about the nudity or anything, because I do have the nude photos of me on Instagram. But I think the more sort of organic, like the more just, the bathroom selfie or something that I will set up and create for myself usually is more of a private experience, but something that I really love and value, and also really crosses into new terrain of like who to share that with, because I have some girlfriends of mine where we're platonic friends, we're in a group chat and we share nude selfies of ourselves to each other in the group chat to big each other up, to
Yeah, I love
share,
that.
to be seen. This is what I'm wearing tonight. What do you think? And it's a full nude selfie, and it's received with love, and like we're supporting each other. So it's sort of, we're sharing a sexual aspect of ourselves, but it's in a totally platonic circumstance. So, so that's sort of more, I do more of that. And then, selfies for partners or for you. But I think I need to maybe share some more selfies. I'm feeling really inspired by this conversation. Like, you just asked me that. I'm like, why aren't I sharing more selfies?
But I think it does come down to the judgment that you fear, and I would fear on your behalf, of if you were to use your platform to post something, you would inevitably, just by virtue of the fact that it was like a more raw kind of sexy selfie, there'd be pushback, because people would, take all the things that you've been talking about, Emma, and they go, oh, well, that's not like very artistic. So why would she possibly be posting that? There's got to be some kind of motives behind. Do you think there would be any pushback, or?
I'm not sure if there'd be any pushback. I mean, people have their judgments, and people are going to have their judgments about anything, really.
Yeah, haters going to hate, right?
Like, the haters are going to hate what I'm doing no matter what anyway. So whatever. I think it just comes down to the fact that I actually am in a situation where we have a lot of these photos. So, there's already a bit of a backlog there, and always new ones that we're making. And I just sort of gravitate towards those for the writing. But look, after this conversation, I think I'm going to be.
Because we also talk, like Abby and I also talk a lot, Emma, about selfies as a form of communication. Because we find that there's such a power, especially erotically, in kind of sharing privately selfies that were like very specifically taken. When you were talking with the different models that you worked with, did any of them talk about, because obviously they're posting their selfies in an Instagram context or in an online context, but did they share that there was any form of using selfies as communication as well in like erotic contexts?
Yeah, most of them, I think, talked about sharing with partners.
Right.
And I'd say a good half of them had some pretty bad responses from partners as well, which I was quite sad to hear.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. I mean, sorry, qualify that. There was a sharing, the old sharing sexy selfies between just intimate images which don't see the light of day. Beyond that, was a positive experience for them. But what the partners struggled with was then anything that was even remotely public or not for the partner.
Yes. Yeah.
That's when it became,
there triggered a jealousy
a little possessive thing going on or something like that. And a couple of them, even quite violent circumstances. So,
right.
Yeah, which didn't in fact shut any of them down. They kept doing what they were doing with their own selfies.
That's a really interesting dynamic where, of course, men start to become possessive in that way. And something that we kind of really try and unpack, especially with our non-monogamous experiences and non-monogamous journey, especially myself as a man, is like, what are those trigger points for those possessiveness? Like, how am I unpacking this, like maybe a sense of patriarchy, maybe a sense of, also like I should be showing myself in public to be hyper possessive because that is what makes a good man. That's what makes a good partner. If Abby is posting this selfie and I say, I get her to take it down, what am I really leveraging there? Am I just leveraging some sort of kind of power, this dominant kind of male, like you shouldn't be posting that, you're mine, you can't have your own sexual autonomy, you can't have your own sexual expression in an online space? Thinking
about the ways that a lot of women obviously respond to that, Liam, is to think that men have that sense of entitlement, right, over women and women's bodies. And I think that's certainly true to a large degree in patriarchal cultures, of course. But I think what you're touching on there is something that really interests me around whether there's a really deep vulnerability actually that you have, or a deep fear. I mean, I suppose it must be a fear of something that is social again, that you're afraid of losing the approval of the group, or, other men's approval or something like that, which is stuff that we'd love to say we're, consciously beyond, but it's pretty hard to move past some of that stuff that is really deep, right?
Yeah, well, there is that social pressure that, you'd never want someone to be like, oh, your partner's like overly sexual online. Like there's that weird kind of stigma, especially in heteronormative, like monogamous culture. If your partner's doing something that might be seen as untoward or, hypersexual, then that's a reflection on you as a man.
Coming back to, she's not getting her needs met by you. Yes. So she's out there having to she's putting herself
Peacock.
out
Yeah.
there. Yeah.
It's funny, isn't it? Because like, of course, that older idea of patriarchy is like literally that men possessed women, right? Like they were actually possessed in marriage and so on. And it was that, hyper monogamy and women couldn't escape it, or if they did, there was no money and all that kind of stuff, which we have a hangover from still, right? And so to me, it seems like women who are interested in showing their bodies publicly or in polyamorous relationships or so on is actually deeply anti-patriarchal, right? It really throws back that idea of possessiveness, of, having to attend to the man's needs and so on and service just one man, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
In these really heteronormative and hyper-monogamous situations. And I think that while you have all these people saying, but it's not feminist enough to take sexy selfies and put them on Instagram, it's actually really anti-patriarchal, I reckon.
I feel like there can be this almost coming back to that gatekeeper conversation around, what should be shared, or this isn't feminist, and, we need to control this, what images there are. And actually by giving access, people have their own autonomy to take their own photo, no matter sort of where they are, who they are, what their body is. It's like on a social, cultural, on a mass level, it's like it comes also down to like everybody is entitled to have a sexual expression,
right?
Like no matter their body shape, where they're from. It's like that's, and by having that, by taking that photo and by having that is like it's almost like it's a pushback to some of the arguments that a certain group of people might be holding, saying don't do that because it's not feminist enough. But it's like it's just so much more accessible, I feel, as well.
I keep asking myself, what really is the fear? This seems to be maybe the central question we've all asked here. It's like, what is the fear? And it seems to me to come back to this idea of like somehow there's going to be the breakdown of our society, that these really patriarchal rules we've had in place have been some sort of order to things. And I guess there has been some order, but to the detriment of pretty well everybody, and that there's a fear that we're moving away from that to something that's a bit harder to control. I mean, that's the word to use, isn't it? Which is pretty sad, really.
Yeah.
But lots of especially young women are much more, I think able to say, I'm not going to follow your rules and this is what I need to do for myself. And collectively, I think that's better.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like the worry around what's going to happen if everybody is like having their autonomy or their like sexual liberation. It's like, what is that then going to lead to? And I'm thinking, well, this is all fantastic. I think it's really healthy and really wonderful.
Well, it's really a moral panic.
Yeah, totally.
It feels like this sense that a lot of people might think, oh, there's going to be this social contagion. Maybe it's driven from religiosity and like hyper-conservatism. Maybe it's coming from different corners of social conditioning. But the idea that everyone just starts posting beautiful, sexy selfies of themselves, and men as well. I think when I see Abby's selfies, of which, as I've mentioned, I'm a great fan of, and something that we have always kind of shared with each other, I always find it difficult to reciprocate that as a man, because when I'm taking a selfie of myself, it feels kind of it feels like I have less tools to kind of take something artistic in my mind. I feel like the male form doesn't lend itself as well. There's like less poetry to it. And maybe that's, my bias because, I'm a straight man. But there is that sense of like, how do I make the male form interesting?
Look, I'm a queer woman and I love the female body, so I'm a little biased as
Preaching
well.
to the converted.
Yeah. But I do think also, wouldn't it be lovely if men could describe each other as beautiful more often than we do? And I think because the male body is beautiful, right? It can be, all bodies are beautiful.
Yeah.
And it would be so lovely, I think, if that poetry could come in, especially between men. I see it, you describe you and your friends and you sharing those kinds of images. And it's a real body affirmation or sort of a, beauty affirmation in a sense.
Yeah.
Wouldn't it be lovely if you had that? And that's the same language, I think.
Yeah.
Not just the old, hunk, or that's kind of old now, but whatever it is.
I can't even imagine being in a group chat with a bunch of male friends and sending selfies like that. I mean, it would be beautiful. And I'd
hey dude, you look beautiful today.
Yeah. And I love that. And I think there is a move, certainly amongst my friends, like there's open expressions, we feel comfortable saying like, I love you. And really beautiful, progressive ways in which we're pushing kind of a healthy masculinity forward. But I think that there is, especially within the Australian culture, there is this hyper masculinity of a masculine man looks like, a lifeguard on Bondi Beach. Like that is what an Australian, the epitome of Australian masculinity. And if we loop back into, like the canon of amazing photographers who've caught the male form, like someone like Robert Mapplethorpe, I can look at his photos and I think, oh, there's such beauty in the male form. But he also gravitates towards this very hyper masculine trope of like big muscles. All the men are extremely well endowed. There is a very specific thing that he is capturing with, his male gaze and trying to capture male beauty.
Maybe you should do it, Liam.
Maybe. Well, I have spoken to Abby recently. I'd love to take some male nudes, actually.
Yeah, and I think that's where there's the importance. It comes back to the selfie and the importance of like people having access to this and doing this and feeling empowered and not judged to take photos so that other people can also, if they did want to share, it's like people can see themselves in photos. It's like you're looking at the nudes of men and you don't necessarily see yourself in those images perhaps.
Absolutely.
So you're like, where is my place here to take a photo and to share it?
Yeah.
I mean, you're a babe. You know what I mean?
It's overcoming those social scripts though, isn't it?
Yeah.
Those cultural scripts which say that you can't look at, as a straight man, you can't look at those nudes to begin with because that would somehow make you gay, which is, anathema to so much of that hyper masculine thing in Australia especially.
Yeah.
And I always feel so sad for so many straight men on that front because, it's a really difficult place to be, I think, with each other. And I can't speak for it. I'm obviously not one, but I'm loving this idea that our culture is shifting for men much more towards a care of each other. And I think even being able to use the word love and, you both know that I have an interest in sport, which is starting to focus more and more on the masculinities in sport. And I'm watching, I'm Melbourne born and raised, so AFL is my thing. And the coach of Collingwood uses the word love with his players, which was unheard of 10, 20 years ago. So that's kind of cool,
And also, Liam, you have had your nude photo taken before actually as well.
Yeah.
In New York.
Oh, yes.
We were speaking of Tumblr. So you have had your photo taken before.
I have.
When Liam and I first got together, we were very into Tumblr. I think you introduced me to it, Liam, and it became this beautiful space where we like created a Tumblr. What was it? We had like a profile, an account or something.
Yeah.
We didn't tell anybody about it. Nobody knew it was us, and we would just share things.
Yeah, erotic photography.
Yeah. And so we would repost, share like on our page, and then we'd write little things. And I think perhaps we even shared our own photos as well, did we? Were we uploading on Tumblr?
We were also part of when Tumblr, you could password protect your own private Tumblr. Mm-hmm. So we had our own private Tumblr that we were doing that with.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it was really beautiful and a beautiful creative sharing for us as we were getting to know each other and getting to know each other intimately and romantically and, discovering each other. And there was a photographer on Tumblr who we loved, and you had followed her, I think, for a long time. She was American. And then when we ended up moving to America, I remember it so well. You like rushed into the bedroom one day where I was, and you were like, she's coming through New York and she's doing photo shoots for people for like $200 or something.
Yeah.
And she's going to be here on these dates and she's taking bookings, and she would take these beautiful intimate photos of couples and thruples and
in the throes of intimacy.
In the throes of intimacy. Yeah. And I was like, you know what? Let's just do it. Let's just book her. She seems really chill. We can just we'll just do like what we're comfortable with anyway. And so we organized it. And I remember it was snowing. It was like a Monday morning. It was snowing outside. Obviously, we were having the shoot inside. And I think I got us some like mimosas or something. And
it was like early in the day, but you don't drink now, but we had like some liquid courage.
I was like, well, we'll get the mimosas happening. Yeah. And she came in and she was just this beam of light. She was so warm. And I think, just immediately we felt comfortable with her. And I think, so there's that skill in how comfortable, the photographer in that setting would make you feel. But you were very, very nervous.
Very nervous.
But we relaxed into it, and just beautiful photos of us embracing in the kitchen, and then different things were happening. And then, I think at one point we were actually like we were having sex.
Yes. Yeah.
And she captured these beautiful photos of us. And they're some of my most favorite photos of us ever. They're so special and sacred.
Yeah.
You know, and then years later when I was pregnant, she reached out and
we did a pregnancy
photo shoot with her.
But the amazing thing about her was that she was so beautiful as a photographer, creating that safe space. And when you were working with all the models that you worked with, I'm sure you were very aware of how important that is in those very intimate settings. In order to create the art, you had to create that safe space. So how did you go into those?
Yeah.
Like, how did you kind of craft those spaces?
As a baby photographer, I didn't understand that very well, a little bit, but it was sort of an abstract idea. And I remember I used to stand sort of behind my tripod of my camera and kind of, you know, try to, my hands are up holding the camera kind of right now, try to issue instructions from there, and very nervous and whatever. And it took me years to kind of figure out things like just coming out from around the camera and standing on the same side as the person whose photo I'm taking, and recognizing so deeply how vulnerable it is to stand in front of the camera and give, you know, there's a real giving, I think, from people, from a model or whatever you want to call them, standing in front of the camera. And I respected that so deeply, and still do, that I find every way I can to make them feel comfortable, to, you know, to sort of, and it's not, I mean, sometimes, you know, like the ethics committee, again, I'm rolling my eyes as I say that. You can't hear it in the microphone. I'm certainly rolling my eyes. Was really, you know, all about make sure you ask them if they're okay all the time and check in and da-da-da-da. And I'm like, it became really unnatural to do that, you know, and the more you ask that, the more people think that there's something wrong.
Yeah. Or like, should I not be okay? Like, is
exactly.
this okay?
Yeah,
like,
maybe
why wouldn't
I'm
I
doing
be
something
okay?
wrong, you know, that kind of idea. So that sort of set us up almost as like a perpetrator from the outset. There's that victim perpetrator thing again. So I think it's things like I made sure that we met at least once beforehand for a good amount of time, just in a neutral space over a coffee, and had a really good chat, that they drove as much as possible, asking questions, getting them to talk about whether they had done this kind of thing before, what they expected from it, what they wanted from it, you know, having a good laugh, like really just finding ways to laugh about stuff and be human and relate, you know, just connect on various levels. And then during the shoot, again, making sure, I mean, it's little things like it's a warm space, you've got music going, there's food and drink available, you know, and anybody else I had there, often it was a stylist involved and a hair and makeup person, that they understand the drill as well, because that was an interesting challenge, because they don't necessarily have the same views I do on the sexy selfie, right? So they were, I could see a couple of times they'd be like, oh, we're doing what, you know?
Yeah.
So making sure they're all cool as well. So again, you're not making that person feel like there's a team of people who are just going to, you know, use and sort of exploit them, which is what has been the case, of course. Liam, you and I were talking before about the photographic industry, especially the commercial industries, where models, and often women, have just been used and abused as the old clothes horses, or a really dehumanizing that goes on, you know. And I think the sooner we can get away from this kind of like hero photographer thing to recognize the absolute collaborative nature of pretty much any photo shoot that involves people, the better, you know. So there was that kind of ethos, I guess, in my drive to do this project, and I hope they felt comfortable enough with me.
Because you have to also be very finely attuned to, like you're saying, it's like you don't want to be constantly asking for almost consent, like, are you comfortable? But you have to actually have that in your mind as the photographer, I'm sure. So you're constantly viewing for, you know, are they starting to look uncomfortable?
You're listening and calibrating all the time, for sure. I had this I had a moment with one of the women, Simone, which freaked me out actually, because all this kind of ethics pile on about making sure people were okay, it was in my head. And we were shooting on top of a city building in Melbourne. And she was wearing lingerie and heels and this kind of like cat mask thing, and just having a great time. We'd booked the space and it was all good. Right. And we were packing up and about to leave, and she gets catcalled from someone across the way in another building. And I've just gone, oh shit, you know, this is the moment where I'm going to the whole project's going to fall over because I've done the wrong thing, and she's, you know, unsafe. And I was like, are you okay? Is there anything I could do? She's like, yeah, I'm fine. I'm like, no, really? She's like, it's really fine. It's actually, I'm good, you know? And again, having to just reassure me that things, and she was believable and checking in, you know? But the more I ask again, the more she's like, just leave me alone, you know?
Yeah.
So
you don't want to kind of over interrogate.
Yeah. And again, that assumption that kind of action, I mean, it's never great, but is going to be harmful. Whereas for some people, it's not as harmful as it's not one kind of, it's like any sort of form of trauma, I suppose, isn't it? Like some people respond differently.
And I mean, when you're in a situation like that where you're out in public, you know, you're in a city environment, there's going to be people around. It's like, you know, you can do so much, but then there will be unforeseen things. Like you can't be across, you know, the behavior of everybody else that's in the environment. Yeah. But I think there can also be, you know, then it's like photographing and being in tune with people who they're also of that understanding. And it sounds like she had that understanding of that too.
Yeah.
And it's like she wasn't in like a physical danger or anything.
That's right.
You know, it's, to me, I feel like if you're in public in that way where there will be people around, there will be rogues.
Yeah, it's kind of, yeah, that's right. There's an informed consent going on, right? And I suppose there's risk that we all are aware of.
Yeah.
You know?
One of the powers of the selfie is actually to be able to control your environment as well. So in kind of contrast to that, whenever you're taking a selfie, Abby, like you can take the selfie wherever you are, you know, if it's in the car, if it's in the bathroom, you know, wherever it might be, you are able to completely construct the environment around you and make sure to the best of your ability that there's no influences that you don't want to have in that. So, you know, when you obviously worked to capture these beautiful photos of these models, then afterwards, did you check in with them with how they then kind of approached their own selfie taking? Like, did they actually change the methods in how they did it?
Yeah, I think it did actually to some degree. Not with everyone and not in some kind of wildly different way, but yeah, definitely there was some feedback I got. The verbal feedback was often something like, you know, I had a really great time with you and I have a new confidence in the way that I do my own images. And some of that, I think, I'd like to think anyway, translated to even an aesthetic shift in some things. So they might try, for example, a black and white, you know, image or a different kind of lighting setup than what they had done before. I mentioned Michelle before, who worked in finance and had all the images of her like neck down, decided she wanted to do photos with her face showing.
That's huge.
Well, I think so too.
Yeah.
I feel incredibly privileged and humbled that she wanted to do that with me. And then she did put them on her Instagram feed, and from then on and her own images with her face are what we see now. So all power to her. It's kind of like gives me the chills thinking about it, you know.
It's not just her posting them alone. It's like having that validation that this is beautiful. This, like, it's a, you know, like I see you, like you're in the conversation around it. Like you're not feeling shame towards her about what she's doing. And then that helps, you know, unpack what might be there.
Yeah.
Did you find that with being in the environments together, you're working, you're making the art, taking the photos together, did you feel that there was a bit of storytelling that was coming out, like, you know, in the connection? Like, because I feel like it's quite a vulnerable, it's quite it's an intimate situation to be in, taking someone's photograph like that. Did people start to open up to you in ways about different things that maybe they weren't expecting?
Yes, I'd say so. And not so much during the shooting. That was I guess the way that I shoot's quite a kind of heavily designed, sort of very technical, lots of, you know, lights and studio stuff going on. So we just do that for a while. And then it was in the interviews afterwards where we'd sit with all the images. So the way that it worked, I was trying to think now, I gave them each of the participants all their images, and then kind of a week later say, come and have another coffee with me, and over about an hour and a half we'd have this sort of semi-structured interview where we'd look at the images and talk them through. So it's sort of a photo elicitation process, and all the stories came out then. So that's kind of where I learned about the woman who had the anorexia in her teenage years, and lots of stories of shame, like an incredible, you know, number of stories about being shamed by other people, whether that was teachers, siblings, friends even, who were friends with them until they started taking sexy selfies and then decided they couldn't be friends with them anymore, you know. And then the flip side of that, because I think there's a really nice story that doesn't also get told often enough, is that in taking sexy selfies and putting them on social media, they all found an incredible community of like-minded and supportive women. And this will be no surprise to either of you, I think, but you were talking before, Abby, about your experience with your friends. And it was definitively through that act of taking and sharing semi-nude or a fully nude or whatever it is that built that community. And I think lots of questions, or well, not questions, but I suppose ways of seeing beauty and sharing became really effective and useful to these women. You know, I think our culture again thinks about, or certainly in feminist circles, about beauty being something harmful to women. You know, old beauty practices and the beauty myth from the old Naomi Wolf days is still very present. And of course, it's not an easy, simple answer as it's not all good. But useful forms of using beauty and sharing was and community building. You know, something I did not expect to find in this project.
I can see how they would be community building through that, because for me, it's like when I see a person who is, you know, living their truth, or they're taking their photo, or they're sharing, or they're recognizing their inner, like their value, or, you know, they're taking a photo and they feel bold to share that photo with the world. I feel like there's a sense of letting go of judgment and shame that they would have to have gone through on themselves to feel comfortable to share that, which then makes me feel like they're not going to have that type of shame for me. You know, like it's sort of this like openness with each other. So I can totally see how there would be that, because for me, when I think of shame, I think of constriction, you know, and so it makes sense that these people would find this new community, and people just select themselves in and out of your life, really. I feel like the more that you sort of can share who you are, you know, people choose to opt in and out, and I think that's a positive. It can come with its sadness and its losses, but ultimately
right people at the right time.
The right people at the right time,
yeah. I think also I talk a lot about cultural scripts. You know, I'm kind of broken record on it a little bit, but another one I think is that idea that women who are beautifying themselves or presenting in particular ways are in competition with each other, and that there's like this word cattiness that gets applied to particularly female things. And the opposite is what I found. And I had the women I worked with also speak a lot about the change that they were seeing from when they were perhaps mid-teens to somewhere sort of early mid-20s, where they were seeing a real building up of women rather than a tearing down that was right in the face of that script that says, oh, there's a cattiness amongst women who are, you know, putting lots of makeup on or dressing up. It's like, no, they were really much more collective than the script would say.
Well, Emma, this has been an amazing conversation, and there are so many insights and so many other places where we can take this conversation, and we're going to have a part 2, I think.
We must have a part 2.
We must have a part 2.
We should involve a photo shoot somehow then, right?
Yes.
Oh, wow. Okay. That's
nice idea.
That is a
collective
great
shoot.
idea.
Yeah.
But thank you so much for sharing all your wonderful insights. Your PhD is available to read online.
It is, and I'm going to insist that you'll read it, of course. Cover to cover, right?
Yeah. And I have read it, and it's great. It is absolutely brilliant. And we'll put it in the show notes to this. Yeah, I encourage everyone to kind of dive deep, because there's so many nuanced things to think about in regards to all of the work that you've done. So thank you for sharing it with us today. And we'll have to reconvene.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It's been a genuine pleasure, and I really do appreciate you both having me on. Great to meet you. Can't wait for part 2.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
Thanks for tuning in to the Evolving Love podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and leave a comment on your favorite podcast platform. Your feedback and support fuels our passion, and together we're building a community of curiosity, kindness, and growth.
Subscribe, comment, and let's keep the conversation going.